Hi there. We're here to talk about the Trumpeter HMS Hood model. It's a 350. It's a large scale ship. I wanted to review it and let you guys know what I thought of it. But before I do that, I thought it would be really nice for me to give you a history of the ship. Okay? So if you're not interested in the history of the ship and just the model, then just skip forwards. You can just scroll along on YouTube and then you'll find out where you start seeing the ship. But other than that, yes, I am a massive fan of the Hood. In my opinion, she's the greatest British warship that we ever had. But anyway, we're going to go through the history of her, and then we're going to take a look at the model. And that's probably the thing that you're most interested in seeing, is not the history lesson and not me talking, but the model itself. So let's crack on.
The mighty Hood. Possibly one of the most famous British warships, I think, of all time. The nation loved her. She was basically a pin-up as a ship that everybody was proud of. She got the nickname and a reputation as the mighty Hood, or Hood as some people called her. Don't know why that is. And she reigned supreme for technically nearly over 20 years. She was the largest, fastest and biggest warship in the world. And I don't just mean Great Britain, I mean the entire world. Unfortunately, what people fail to recognise about her, she had the reputation as being a fast battleship, but the reality is she was basically a heavy cruiser. She was longer than a battleship, faster than the battleships, had the same guns as a battleship, but there's one crucial difference between them: her armour. She had weak horizon or deck armour, and her freeboard was very, very low, especially at the stern. I think it was only about 17 foot, which isn't high. So a ship with such a low freeboard, which, as I've just pointed out, is the height between where the water and where the keel sits in the water, didn't make for the greatest ship at sea. However, she was fast, but not the most manoeuvrable of ships because of her length. So turning took a little bit longer than the average warship. But that didn't really matter to her, as far as I'm concerned, because she was fast enough to compensate for it. She had 8 15-inch guns, 4 forward, 4 astern. She was quick. I think in her sea trial she did 32 knots, knocking up that way. Unfortunately, by the time she engaged the Bismarck, which we will get onto, her speed had been reduced because she was in desperate need of a refit. She'd been around the world countless times. She had been in a few actions, and it was coming up for a refit, which unfortunately, because of the British fleet, like they always are, it never happened. So much as she was called a fast battleship just after the First World War, because she was constructed just after Jutland. Actually, she was laid down while the Battle of Jutland went on, and then they suddenly realised there's a problem with British ships, and which it was, as especially the cruisers, it's the deck armour. Now, the deck armour on the Hood to the stern of the ship is only 3 inches, and I don't mean 3 inches in terms of one big fat block of 3 inches. I mean each deck was an inch. Now, the problem you've got here at this point is because weapons had changed at that point. And the Germans they had a delayed charge on the shells. So what the British expected to happen is when the shell hit the first inch of the deck arm, it'd explode, then it would go through to the second, and by the time it hits the third, it should have fizzled out basically, and the damage has already been done, but it shouldn't hit the internal workings or the cordite charges of the ship. Unfortunately, the Germans now were using delay charges. So what happened was it hit the first inch of deck, then the second, then by the time it penetrated the third, then it exploded, and that was in the bows of the ship. And the cordite charges are the things that you need to ignite the shells when you fire them. And bear in mind, the Hood and the Bismarck both had 15-inch guns. So yes, Hood was slightly flawed by that time. Now, as I said, it was always intended for her to go in for a refit and having the rear part of the ship fortified a little bit more with some deck armour. But as Second World War started, they needed the flagship Hood, and she couldn't be spared, so that was it. They had to use her, and this is what led to the catastrophe, which we're going to go into now. Now, okay, let's get back into what's going to happen now to the Hood. So she's in Scapa Flow, the newly commissioned ship Prince of Wales, which still has civilian workers on it. They're ordered to go to basically look out for the Bismarck. They've spotted her. They think she's going to make a break out into the Atlantic, so they send out the Prince of Wales and the aging battlecruiser Hood. Prince of Wales is not really up to the task. She has quadruple turrets, but her guns are only 14 inches, not 15 inches, but she did have 10 of them. But everybody was confident in HMS Hood. So regardless of the Prince of Wales, they think, Hood, no, she's the one to take the charge. She's going to do it. Had Vice Admiral Holland on board. He was taking charge of the situation. So he had a plan, and his plan was to cross the T of the German ships. Now, this is a tactic that goes back to the age of sail from Nelson's time. So what you do is you want to expose a full broadside, so you want all your guns engaged. So the British used the tactic of charging in, then turning a broadside to the enemy, which I never thought was a clever idea, because you make yourself a large target. But they've been doing that since the age of Nelson, who engaged that, which is just basically crossing the T of the enemy. I don't know why they thought that was a good tactic, but I'm sure somebody can put me right on that one. But anyway, that's what Holland's idea was. So here we are. They're coming up to the Denmark Strait. Now, the Norfolk and Suffolk are two cruisers, and they've been shadowing the Bismarck. Now, they're trying to keep track of her with radar, because they've got new radar on them. Yes, the British actually had radar. Unbelievable, isn't it? Now, at this point, the Bismarck finally sees that they are being shadowed by these two cruisers. So it takes a few shots at them, and it knocks out its own radar. The Norfolk and Suffolk suddenly, obviously realise they're no match for the Bismarck. So they take a step back, and they lose contact with her eventually. Holland was counting on them to join the battle, but unfortunately they couldn't keep up with the Hood and the Prince of Wales, so they were lost. But anyway, so they weren't lost, they just weren't in the battle. They arrived too late. So Holland had to guess what was going to happen. But in the meantime, the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen swapped places. So the Prince Eugen was leading and the Bismarck was behind. They were using the Prince Eugen's radar. Now, I know as a British we wouldn't have done that. Even if the radar hadn't worked, we'd have just persevered, because the flagship of the fleet still leads. Sorry guys, that's just how it works. But the Germans aren't quite like that. So the Prince Eugen was leading, followed by the Bismarck. Now, we come to about 5 o'clock-ish in the morning, and the British make sight. They see steam of the German ships. Now, Germans do not want to get involved with heavy units. They're only here for commerce raiding. They don't want to engage because they might get damaged, and they don't have a lot of ships. The British do, and the Germans don't. So they were concerned about engaging heavy units. But the Hood had been sent on a mission with the Prince of Wales. You have to get rid of Bismarck because she's a dangerous threat to the shipping, and we rely on that to survive the war. So much as Holland expected to cross the T of the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen, he didn't. He ended up in a pursuit curve. so he's coming up basically behind them. But he's going at full speed. He's going about 28 knots, and so is the Prince of Wales. Now the Germans knew they could probably outrun the Prince of Wales. The other two ships, the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen, were faster, but they weren't faster than the Hood, so they knew that they had to do something. So the Hood shot first, but it started shooting at the Prince Eugen because it mistook it for the Bismarck, because it expected the Bismarck to be the leading ship. You know, you see, at this point, you see, I get confused, because much as the Prince of Wales wasn't up to the task in terms of it wasn't rigged up yet, it hadn't been, you know, it wasn't a fully trained up crew. It should have led it, because it was a battleship and it had better armour than the Hood. But being typically British, no, our flagship goes in, full guns blazing. So the Hood charged at the Germans, at, as I said, at 28 knots. Now, it's at this point that, as the Prince of Wales, and now you see, this is the thing that confuses me as well. Holland kept the Prince of Wales and the Hood basically in the same. I would have split my units apart, because basically they were making one huge target for the Germans, and you need to order it slightly to hit them. But they carried on, and so the Prince of Wales is basically following the Hood, like it's towing it. I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but it doesn't make any sense. I would have split the units up at that point to engage, and then split the guns up as well. Anyway, they didn't do that. So now the Hood's going in at full speed. Now she's trying she takes a couple of hits, one to the ready use lockers midships, and then one to the conning tower, which I think come from the Prince Eugen, because it went straight through and didn't explode, but it killed everybody up there. So everybody died up there on the conning tower straight away. Now there's a fire gun on the midships of the ship. So Holland is trying to rapidly close the distance, and then he takes a hard turn because he wants to bring the rear guns to engage. And now this is where I have a controversial idea of what happened, because I don't think that the final shell came from the Bismarck, and I don't believe it came from the Prince Eugen. What I initially think is because as the Hood was turning, Y turret engaged, A and B turret were already engaged, X turret didn't move. Now it's my suspicion, and it's entirely up to you to contradict me if you're interested, that I think X turrets, cordite charges and shells got jammed, and I think they basically blew up backwards. They hit all the ammunition backwards into the ship and all the cordite charges, and it just basically went through the ship like a wildfire, and that's what I think destroyed the Hood. So basically what I'm trying to say is X turret and the Hood basically destroyed herself, because that was a 1,000,000 to 1 shot. I don't think that was possible. I think that's what genuinely happened. X turret never engaged, Y turret was moving. What's the point in trying to engage your rear turrets if one of them doesn't work? There's no point. So I think genuinely the Hood blew herself up, but because, you know, it was in need of repair. Well, that's just a speculation. Anyway, the Hood blew up. It took 3 minutes. Only 3 people survived it. And that was the loss of the greatest British warship ever, in my opinion. And that's it. Nothing more to say. Now, as after the catastrophic explosion, so basically the ship's going at 28 knots, and the stern digs into the water, and the bow empties up. Now the reason for this is quite simply because she was doing a hard turn. So I think possibly, maybe, and I can't say this obviously for a fact, that the ship might have stayed intact if she wasn't turning so hard. But she was, and they caught her on an off guard, as I said, and I still think it's X-turret that exploded the emissions in the ship. But anyway, regardless, that's only my opinion. But yes, so as she sank, as she split in half and exploded, she split into 3 or 4 parts. Now, it was reported that she fired one triumphant shot from a turret. Now, I don't believe that. That was, I think, and this is my opinion, that was when the bow blew off from the ship. And it may have looked like a shot, but I think it was a bow blowing up. Because the electrics and the mechanics wouldn't have been working at that point. So, that's just my opinion. Now, we need to take a look at the model, don't we?
Right, my friends. She does have a stand, by the way. Now, this particular version of the hood is the waterline model. And what I mean by that is you can separate it from the bow and then reattach it. Now, as a model, let me just put it back to as it should be. Let's get a bit closer, shall we? Now, as a version of the hood, it's quite nice. Turrets will move, and the ones to the stern move. This is a labour of love. It's taken me about a year to build this, as you can tell by the detail. It is very detailed. Don't know what that was just moved. Something just moved on it. As a model, which I'll bring it up closer, and the scale is quite nice. Now, there's a few issues I have with this Trumpeter model. First and foremost, you don't get the wooden deck. Now, I had to buy that separately, and it took me 2 attempts. I'll show you. One sec. This is how the wooden deck, and it is actually wood, but it's really thin, and you have to be so careful when you're trying to apply it. I had to actually buy the wooden decking twice, which was kind of annoying because I had to wait, and then it you know, it just slowed things down. I didn't want it to happen like that. Secondly, you can only buy the 1941 hood. You can't buy the 1920 hood. And as you've previously heard in my video, the ship in the 1920s was different to the ship in the 1940s. Now, you see, you have these. Now I'm going to show you this. Sorry, I can't quite make it out in the camera. Wait, I'm just going to have to readjust that. There we go. These gaps. See, the hood had a secondary armament there in the 1920s, but they removed them for purposes of weight, really, and they didn't see they were necessary for the ship. But you don't get a choice. You have to have the 1940s hood, or you get no hood, which is a bit of a pain in the arse. No railings, as I've previously said, which annoys me. You can buy them, but they're really thin and flimsy, and I tried to apply them once, but it didn't. I don't know, the glue just doesn't seem to stick to them, and it was just like, I don't know, just a waste of time. Other than that, the detail of the ship is really nice. I do have another minor criticism, actually 2 minor criticisms, so you'll have to bear with me on that. Around about here, I think now, around about there, it should say hood, but it doesn't, because for whatever reason they didn't bother doing it. Another problem I have is, you see the stern mounted mast for sailing the ensign on. Well, it should have one on the bow. Nope. looked everywhere, looked through all the bits and pieces. As I said, I spent a year making this. There is not one. For some unknown reason, God only knows. And the other thing that I do have a criticism of it is there's no rigging. You don't get the rigging with the ship. Now, I'm tempted to, will it have to be twine or something, you know, or sewing cotton, to do the rigging, because I've looked everywhere, there isn't any for it. Which is kind of disappointing, actually, considering the quality. I mean, I love the fact that you can separate the bow from it and you can display it like it's at sea. And that is brilliant. I mean, I love that. Also, the chains here, they came with the wooden deck plating. You don't get them with the ship either. Which, you know, this cost me 90 quid. And I've had to do all the work. I've had to buy all the paint and the decking and everything else. So, all in all, I think this is a really, genuinely nice crafted model of the HMS Hood. Providing you spend a lot of time. As I said, it's taken me a year to build this ship. And as I said, it's my favourite warship of all time. And you know the history of her now, because I've explained it to you. And would I recommend this as a potential model for somebody who's interested in building model battleships? Well, yes, I would. She's a lovely looking ship, isn't she? And there you go. That's it. That's my recommendation, and I should know. I've studied a lot about the Hood. I have 2 books that, if you're really interested in the Hood, not necessarily the model in general, but the ship, I'm going to show you, because I have lots of books. Right. How the Hood functioned and worked, and what she'd been through, and the situation that she found herself in, and the condition that she was in, which was really, really quite bad. She was even had I think an infestation of cockroaches, because she'd been abroad so many times. And to say nothing, the British used to call her the wettest ship in the fleet, because when she was at sea and the sea was bad, can you imagine trying to use the bathroom? And no, no, we won't go down that route, but this is an absolute must-read if you want to know the history of the Hood. Can't recommend that enough. And the other one, as you'll notice, it has a marker in it, because I haven't finished everything on it yet. I just want to keep going back to certain parts. Is when they found the Hood. And this is from David Mearns. Now, David Mearns is a bit like Robert Ballard. He is one of those blokes who is, you know, is exceptional in terms of deep sea dive, in terms of finding ships. I mean, I think the Hood's like, I think a couple of miles down. But David Mearns found it, and he kept where the ship was secret for a long time. And then he allowed it, because they went back down again and had a look. But he's the only one who's ever wanted to look for the Hood. I mean, the Bismarck was found by Bob Ballard, but nobody thought to look for the Hood. But in this book, you'll find everything you need to know about the condition of the Hood now as she lays at the bottom of the sea. And believe me, you would... Yeah, well, to say it's a wreck would be an understatement. It's separated basically into 4 parts. I've gone through this before, but it is in 4 parts. But this book goes through all of it, and David Mearns is the person to turn to. And he has documentaries on the Hood, and I would highly recommend you watch the documentaries, or at least read the book. And there you go. So you've got a history lesson and look at the Trumpeter model, which is the 350. Now, just one more thing. I'm not Columbo. One more thing before I go. Here we have the Belfast. Now, she's a work that I haven't finished her yet, so I will get there with her. But I'm taking my time because I only just got the wooden deck for her, so I couldn't get any further. But this is the Belfast, and the Belfast, you're getting a bonus on this one. Belfast is still moored up in England. She still exists. She was a great cruiser, and she done her country very proud. She had a basically she ran over a mine and her back was broken, and they were going to scrap her. Literally, this is just a few days of her going to service. But they said, well, no, we'll keep her back, we'll fix her, and we'll get her back into action. And they did. And the Belfast turned out to be one of the greatest cruisers ever for what she did. And she obviously lasted the whole war. Now, one more thing I need to say. Yep, not Columbo again, please. I understand. People, when we had the Olympic Games here, and I'm going back some years now, and they airbrushed out the Belfast because they thought it would send bad messages. Well, I'm disgusted, because that ship and that crew, for what they did for this country, and you airbrushed it out, I'm sorry. I'm just... words fail to describe how disgusted I am with this country. And there you go. So, now you had a look at the hood, a brief reminiscence about the Belfast, and I've given you the history of the hood as well. And if this was any interest to you, please comment and let me know your thoughts. And in the meantime, take care, guys.